Right now, you will learn 10 deadly secrets of Victorian medicine that claim many lives. Doctors of that time, armed with theories that today cause only bewilderment, made discoveries and at the same time made fatal mistakes. Their offices were not so much temples of healing as laboratories for risky experiments on human health. Women were particularly vulnerable in this system, as their ailments were often attributed to weak nerves and treated with methods more akin to sophisticated punishment. In this video, we will lift the veil on Victorian medicine and look into its darkest corners. We won't talk about blood or infections, but we'll focus on poisons that were considered medicines and procedures that crippled souls. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how the pursuit of beauty could lead to a slow decline, and why a diagnosis of hysteria was a sentence to a special kind of confinement for women. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of Victorian beauties, which they took with them to their graves. In a society where a woman's status was determined by her appearance and a successful marriage, beauty was not just a desire, but a necessity. The main canon of beauty was aristocratic pallor, symbolizing purity and wealth. A tan was associated with the lower classes, with those who were forced to work in the fields under the scorching sun. Therefore, ladies from high society did everything they could to achieve the fashionable, transparent complexion. They hid from the sun under umbrellas and veils, but this was not enough. Cosmetics came to the rescue, but not the kind we know today, but deadly ones. Pharmacies and perfume shops freely sold wafers for improving complexion containing arsenic. Manufacturers promised that regular intake of these tablets would make the skin radiant, clear, and perfectly pale. Women, striving to conform to the ideal, took this poison daily, unaware of the consequences. Arsenic did indeed make the skin paler by destroying red blood cells, but at the same time it slowly accumulated in the body, causing chronic poisoning. Symptoms of poisoning, weakness, malaise, digestive problems, were often attributed to typical women's ailments. Doctors simply shrugged their shoulders or prescribed sedatives. No one linked the deterioration of health to seemingly harmless cosmetics. In addition to pills, arsenic was added to powders, lotions, and even soap. Women were surrounded by poison on all sides, becoming victims of fashion in the truest sense of the word. Their pursuit of beauty, dictated by strict social norms, turned into slow suicide. The standard of beauty was considered to be a fragile, almost unearthly image of a woman incapable of physical labor. The irony was that the cosmetics designed to create this image made women physically weak in reality. It was a vicious circle in which social expectations were reinforced by dangerous chemicals. The pressure from society was so great that even knowing the possible risks, many could not give up dangerous cosmetics. Being unattractive in the Victorian world meant being invisible, losing the chance for a decent life. Therefore, women continued to buy beauty, paying for it with their own health. This story is a vivid example of how social pressure on women, compounded by medical ignorance, created a deadly trap. Beauty demanded sacrifices, and Victorian ladies made them without even realizing it. They were hostages to an ideal that was destroying them. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how modern beauty standards affect health and how far we have come from Victorian times? Write about it in the comments. What if everything doctors had been taught for centuries was outdated and dangerous misinformation? Victorian medicine was based largely not on knowledge of microbes, but on the ancient theory of miasms. It was believed that diseases were caused not by microorganisms, but by bad air emanating from decaying organic waste. This miasmatic air, according to doctors, penetrated homes and human bodies, causing cholera, typhoid, and other diseases. Therefore, the main strategy for combating disease was not hygiene, but the fight against unpleasant odors. Cities were enveloped in the scent of carbolic acid and bleach, which were used to purify the air. This theory directly influenced everyday life, especially the lives of women who were traditionally responsible for the home. It was believed that the home should be a fortress protecting against harmful miasmas. Windows were kept tightly closed to keep out the outside air, which was considered the main source of infection. The interiors of Victorian homes were overloaded with heavy curtains, carpets, canopies, and lots of decorative trinkets. All these items accumulated dust and prevented air circulation, creating an ideal environment for the spread of real pathogens. But housewives saw them as an additional barrier against miasmas. Women spent enormous effort fighting odors, but not their source. They used scented sachets, burned incense, and placed vases of flowers around the house in an attempt to mask the smell of disease. At the same time, fundamental problems, such as the lack of proper sanitation, were ignored. The miasma theory led to absurd recommendations. Doctors advised building hospitals away from swampy areas and avoiding walks in the evening, when harmful vapors were supposedly particularly strong. This advice gave a false sense of security and distracted from real preventive measures. What modern miasms or misconceptions about health do you think still influence our lives today? But what if I told you that sometimes a woman's worst enemy was not an invisible miasma, but the doctor himself and his methods of treatment, which turned the home into a veritable prison? In the next chapter, you will learn about treatment by rest, which was worse than the disease itself. What I am about to show you was a treatment method that today would be considered a form of sophisticated psychological torture. The Victorian era gave rise to a mysterious and all-encompassing diagnosis for women: hysteria. It covered everything from postpartum depression and anxiety to simple disobedience to one's husband or unwillingness to follow social norms. Women were considered to be weak, emotional, and prone to nervous breakdowns by nature. Any display of strong emotions, intelligence, or independence could be seen as a symptom of the disease. American doctor Silas Weir Mitchell took it upon himself to treat this disease and came up with the famous treatment by rest. At first glance, the method seemed humane. Women needed to be relieved of all stress and given complete rest. However, in practice, this turned into total isolation. Patients were locked in a room for a period of 6 weeks to several months, completely cut off from the outside world. She was forbidden from doing anything that could stimulate her nervous system. She was not allowed to read, write, do needlework, or even get out of bed without permission. Her only entertainment was contemplating the walls of her prison cell. The woman was deprived of any independence, turning her into a helpless creature. She was force-fed, often with very fatty and high-calorie food, as it was believed that weight gain helped to strengthen the nerves. A nurse monitored her every move, never leaving her alone for a minute. This method was not so much a treatment as a way to break a woman's will and return her to the patriarchal ideas of proper behavior. After several weeks of such sensory deprivation and complete inactivity, any woman would become apathetic and submissive. This was considered recovery. This practice is one of the most striking examples of the oppressed position of women in Victorian society. Her body and mind did not belong to her. Any deviation from the prescribed role was considered a pathology that had to be corrected by completely suppressing the personality. Are you ready for the shocking truth about eternal youth sold in bottles? At the end of the Victorian era, the world was shaken by the discovery of a new element: radium. Its ability to glow in the dark and emit energy seemed like a real miracle, and society was gripped by a veritable radium fever. Entrepreneurs and medical charlatans quickly realized that this miracle could be profitable. Radium was declared a panacea for all diseases. It was credited with the ability to cure cancer, restore youth, increase vitality, and even improve mental abilities. A huge number of products containing real radium appeared on the market. Consumers were offered radium water, chocolate, toothpaste, face creams, and even underwear. It was believed that the more radium you consumed, the healthier and more energetic you would become. Radium water, such as Radiator, was particularly popular. Manufacturers claimed that it charged the body with energy from within. Wealthy industrialists and socialites drank several bottles a day, believing it to be an elixir of health and longevity. No one suspected the danger that this glowing element posed. People enthusiastically consumed radioactive products, unaware that each dose was slowly destroying their bodies from within. Radium accumulated in their bones, causing terrible consequences. Visually, everything looked appealing. Clocks with radium hands glowed beautifully in the dark, and cosmetics promised radiant skin. This aesthetic of wonder and magic completely overshadowed the potential threat. Women, as the main consumers of cosmetics and beauty products, were one of the main target audiences. They were promised eternal youth and radiance, but in reality, they were sold a slow and painful death. Creams containing radium were supposed to smooth out wrinkles, but in fact caused skin damage. The realization came only decades later, when the long-term consequences of the radium fever began to manifest themselves. People who actively consumed radioactive products began to suffer from previously unknown diseases. But in the Victorian era, radium remained a symbol of progress and hope for healing. This story shows how the thirst for profit and widespread belief in scientific progress can give rise to deadly trends. Lack of knowledge about radiation turned a miracle cure into a silent poison that people took voluntarily. Society was blinded by the light of the new element and did not see the shadow it cast. Why do you think people so easily believed in the healing power of a dangerous element? In the next chapter, you will learn how another fashion item, considered the standard of elegance, literally deformed women's bodies from within. The corset was not just an item of women's clothing in the Victorian era. It was a social institution, a tool for shaping not only the body, but also behavior. From an early age, girls were laced into corsets to give their figures the fashionable hourglass silhouette. The ideal was an unnaturally thin waist, which could only be achieved through severe deformation of the body. Corsets were made of durable fabric and reinforced with whalebone or steel inserts. The lacing at the back allowed them to be tightened to the limit, literally squeezing the internal organs. The pressure from society was enormous. A woman without a corset was considered promiscuous or belonging to the lower class. Therefore, ladies wore this elegant noose from morning to night, despite the obvious discomfort. Constant wearing of a corset had serious health consequences. It displaced internal organs, made breathing difficult, and disrupted blood circulation. The muscles of the back and abdomen atrophied as the rigid frame took over all the supporting functions. Women in corsets often fainted due to lack of oxygen. This phenomenon was so common that society considered it a sign of a refined and sensitive nature. In reality, it was a direct result of physical suffocation. The corset restricted not only breathing, but also freedom of movement. It was difficult to bend over, walk quickly, or lift anything heavy while wearing it. This made women physically dependent and helpless, which was entirely in line with patriarchal ideas about their role. Doctors of the time saw the problem, but their attitude was ambivalent. Some criticized overly tight lacing, but few advocated for the complete abandonment of the corset. It was considered necessary for maintaining a woman's moral and physical health by preventing her from letting herself go. Thus, the corset was not just a piece of clothing. It was an instrument of social control that physically embodied the idea that women should be weak, restricted, and dependent. Their bodies were literally shaped to meet the demands of the patriarchal world. The secret for which Victorian women paid with their health and freedom was often hidden in a small bottle on a shelf in a pharmacy. Victorian medicine took an extremely vague approach to women's ailments. Any complaints, from depression to simple fatigue, were attributed to weak nerves or the female constitution. Instead of looking for the real cause of the suffering, doctors prescribed a simple and universal remedy: sedative syrups. These mixtures, such as Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, promised instant relief from anxiety, insomnia, and nervous disorders. They were available without a prescription and were inexpensive. The secret to their effectiveness was simple and terrifying. Most of these syrups contain opiates, specifically morphine and laudanum. These substances did indeed bring calm and oblivion, but they also caused rapid and severe addiction. Women who started taking the syrup for mild ailments found themselves trapped without even realizing it. Advertisements for these products were aimed specifically at women. Manufacturers portrayed them as a salvation for exhausted housewives suffering from migraines and fatigue. A bottle of syrup was presented as a harmless remedy that would allow women to remain calm and be good wives and mothers. Society turned a blind eye to this problem. Women's addiction to opiates was not considered a serious problem, but rather another manifestation of their weak nature. Husbands often encouraged their wives to take these syrups, as it made them more docile and quiet. Thus, women's real problems, whether physical illness, psychological difficulties, or simply the burdens of daily life, were ignored. Instead of help and support, they were offered chemical oblivion. It was an effective way to silence women and keep them from causing trouble. The spread of these syrups led to a hidden epidemic of addiction among women, especially those in the middle and upper classes. They suffered in silence, behind the closed doors of their elegant homes. Their tragedy was invisible to a society that preferred to see them as angelic creatures rather than living human beings. Do you think the approach to women's healthcare has fundamentally changed today? Or have some problems simply taken on a new form? In the next chapter, we will discuss a more radical method of cleansing the body, which was considered a universal remedy for all diseases. Despite scientific breakthroughs, many Victorian doctors were still captivated by the ancient theory of the four humors. This theory claimed that human health depended on the balance of four basic fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Any disease was considered the result of an imbalance of these humors. Accordingly, the main method of treatment was to restore this imaginary balance. To do this, very radical methods of cleansing the body were used. It was considered necessary to remove excess bad humors to make room for good ones. One of the most popular methods was bloodletting. Doctors believed that removing a certain amount of blood could cure almost anything, from fever to melancholy. This procedure was so routine that it was performed for any reason, often leaving patients extremely weak. Another common method was the prescription of powerful laxatives and emetics. These were believed to help the body get rid of excess bile and phlegm. Patients were literally forced to undergo painful cleansing procedures, which in fact only dehydrated and exhausted them. These methods were used on everyone, but women were especially often victims. Their delicate nature, according to doctors, was particularly prone to humoral imbalance. Any emotional outburst or complaint about feeling unwell could be a reason for aggressive treatment. Doctors also had special devices in their arsenal, such as cupping glasses, which were placed on the skin to draw out bad humors. Leeches were also widely used, as they were considered an ideal means of local bloodletting. Patients revered these procedures, believing in their healing power. The legacy of medieval medicine was very enduring. Even against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution and great discoveries, a patient could encounter methods in a regular doctor's office that had not changed since the time of Hippocrates. It was a world where progress and archaism existed side by side. In the medicine cabinet of a Victorian family, one could find many medicines that today we would unhesitatingly call poisons, and the queen among such medicines was mercury. Preparations based on it, such as calomel, were considered a universal remedy for almost all diseases. Doctors prescribed mercury for constipation, melancholy, syphilis, and even teething in infants. It was believed to have a powerful cleansing effect and to be capable of expelling any disease from the body. Patients took it in the form of pills, powders, and ointments. Calomel, mercury chloride, was especially popular. It was given in huge doses, causing excessive salivation and intestinal upset. Doctors considered these symptoms a sign that the medicine was working and that the disease was leaving the body. In fact, these were signs of acute heavy metal poisoning. Mercury accumulated in the body, slowly destroying the nervous system, kidneys, and other organs. But in the Victorian era, these consequences were not directly linked to the use of medicines. People who took mercury preparations for a long time suffered from characteristic symptoms. They developed tremors in their hands, lost their teeth, became irritable, and even went mad. The phrase "mad as a hatter" came about precisely because hat makers used mercury and suffered from chronic poisoning. This approach turned treatment into a real test of endurance. Only the strongest survived, but their recovery was attributed not to the strength of their bodies, but to the miraculous power of poisonous drugs. Medicine at that time was often guided by the principle of fighting fire with fire. It was only towards the end of the era that the first doubts about the safety of mercury began to emerge. But for decades, it remained one of the pillars of Victorian pharmacology. Thousands of people were poisoned by those who were supposed to treat them, in the name of theories that had no scientific basis. Surgery in the Victorian era took a huge step forward with the discovery of anesthesia. Patients no longer had to endure hellish pain during operations. However, this discovery also had a dark side. Freed from the screams of their patients, surgeons became bolder. They began to perform longer and more complex operations, penetrating deep into the body cavity. But one crucial element was still missing from their work: an understanding of the need for sterility. The Victorian operating room was more like a theater. Operations were often performed in public, in amphitheaters filled with students and onlookers in street clothes. The air was filled with dust and germs, but no one cared. The surgeon himself did not consider it necessary to maintain cleanliness. He could come to the operation straight from the street in his everyday clothes. The height of chic was a frock coat covered with old stains. They testified to the doctor's great experience and extensive practice. Hands were not washed before surgery, and instruments were wiped with a rag at best. The same scalpel or probe could be used on several patients in a row without any treatment. No one saw the connection between dirt and post-operative complications. The lack of understanding about antiseptics turned any operation into Russian roulette. Even the simplest and most successful intervention could end fatally due to subsequent infection. Hospitals at that time were veritable hotbeds of nosocomial infections. Surgical wards were overcrowded, and patient care was minimal. Dressings were reused multiple times. The chances of surviving surgery were extremely low, and people feared surgeons as much as they feared the disease itself. Early doctors, such as Ignaz Semmelweis and Joseph Lister, who spoke out about the need to wash hands and sterilize instruments, were met with ridicule and harassment from their colleagues. The idea that invisible germs could cause disease seemed absurd and insulting to the status of doctors. The acceptance of microbial theory and the introduction of antiseptics revolutionized surgery. But for most of the Victorian era, surgeons operated blindly. They saved some lives, but unwittingly destroyed many others through their ignorance. This story shows how one fundamental misconception can negate all progress. Anesthesia gave surgeons the ability to work, but it was the lack of sterility that made their work deadly dangerous. It was an era of brilliant, but, from a modern perspective, unsanitary surgeons. The Victorian era was fascinated by electricity. This new mysterious force, capable of lighting cities and powering machines, seemed to be the key to all of nature's mysteries. It is not surprising that medicine did not remain immune to the general enthusiasm. This led to the birth of electrotherapy, a treatment method based on the effects of electric current on the human body. Quacks and respectable doctors alike proclaimed electricity to be a panacea for a huge list of ailments. It was believed that it could restore vital energy and cure everything from paralysis to baldness. Electrotherapy was especially popular for treating nervous disorders, particularly in women. Any manifestations of hysteria, melancholy, or simply bad mood were considered indications for the use of electric current. It was a scientific and progressive method of combating female emotionality. A variety of bizarre devices for home use appeared on the market. Electric belts, brushes, corsets, and even chairs promised effortless healing. Advertisements convinced consumers that simply exposing themselves to a weak electric current was enough to regain health and vigor. Electrotherapy sessions in the doctor's office resembled a theatrical performance. The patient was seated in a chair, connected to electrodes from an induction coil, and electric currents were passed through their body. The sensations ranged from a slight tingling to very painful shocks. There was virtually no scientific basis for this method. Doctors used trial and error, applying electrodes to different parts of the body in the hope of achieving the desired effect. Positive results were most often explained by the placebo effect. Patients believed so strongly in the miraculous power of electricity that they actually felt better. Electrotherapy was a convenient treatment for doctors. It did not require complex diagnoses and allowed them to offer patients active, impressive treatment. For women whose complaints were often ignored, even such attention from a doctor could bring psychological relief. Some devices were specifically designed to treat women's diseases. There were special electrodes for internal use that were supposed to treat gynecological problems. In reality, such interventions were not only useless, but also dangerous. The widespread enthusiasm for electrotherapy was a symptom of the era. Society, intoxicated by technological progress, was ready to believe in any miracle if it was dressed up in a scientific guise. Electricity became a new religion, and doctors became its priests. Although electricity did find its application in some areas, such as physiotherapy, Victorian electrotherapy was mostly quackery. It was yet another example of how fashion and ignorance can give rise to a whole layer of useless and sometimes dangerous medicine. We looked behind the glittering facade of the Victorian era and saw a world of medicine full of misconceptions, dangerous practices, and outright poisons. Doctors of the time, sincerely wanting to help, often caused irreparable harm, guided by outdated theories and social prejudices. This had a particularly strong impact on women, whose health and minds became a testing ground for the most risky experiments. Stories about arsenic in cosmetics, treatment by rest, and opium syrups are not just curiosities from the past. They are a stark reminder of how dangerous a combination of ignorance, social dogma, and blind faith in authority can be. It is a lesson in the importance of being critical of any panaceas and always remembering the human dignity of the patient. Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Perhaps you are interested in medicine from another era or other hidden sides of history. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the mysteries of the past.